Welcome to In Focus with Ejaz Haider. On 5th January 1949, the United Nations Commission for India and Pakistan presented a proposal to Pakistani and Indian governments. UNCIP was formed through UN Security Council Resolution 47 of 21st April 1948, which was pursuant to the first UNSC Resolution 39 of January 20, 1948. The 5th Jan proposal was the second after Pakistan and India objected to the first proposal presented by the UNCIP to both countries on 13th August 1948. By most accounts, this proposal would have worked but for India's attitude. It objected to the term withdrawal of bulk of its forces, and it refused to let Pakistan see its plan of withdrawal. The UNCIP proposals were followed by the appointment through another UNSC resolution of Australian jurist Sir Owen Dixon. Let me read out an excerpt from Joseph Corbel, who was a Czech diplomat and political scientist, and he was also chair of the UNCIP. And this is an article which he wrote, and it's titled Kashmir Dispute After 6 Years. In this, among other things, he writes, the report of Sir Owen to the Security Council testifies to his brilliant mind and almost inexhaustible ingenuity in reconciling the views of India and Pakistan on the Kashmir problem and in proposing democratic solutions. First, he prepared a plan for demilitarization. Pakistan accepted it, India rejected it. Then he made alternative proposals for the administration of the country to ensure a free plebiscite. To each of these proposals, he countered a firm Indian no. In the end, he became convinced that India's agreement would never be obtained to demilitarization in any such form or to provisions governing the period of the plebiscite of any such character, or would, in his opinion, permit the plebiscite being conducted in conditions sufficiently guarding against intimidation and other forms of influence and abuse by which the freedom and fairness of the plebiscite might be imperiled. And this also has quotes from Sir Owen Dixon himself. Now, this is a clear indictment of India's approach to the dispute. Let me now get to tonight's panel. I'm joined by Mr. Munir Akram, Pakistan's permanent representative to the United Nations, and Ali Sultan, a leading international law expert who also consults for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Let me begin with Ambassador Akram here. Ambassador Akram, that was then. Now the dispute has its own contours, but we still believe that the ultimate reference to the UN resolutions is the basis not only of the dispute, but also ultimately its resolution. How optimistic is that, or how pragmatic is that?
I think we need to distinguish between the legal position and the reality on the ground. As far as the legal position is concerned, it is irrevocable. The Security Council resolutions prescribing a plebiscite are part of the decisions of the Security Council. They've been agreed to by the two parties, meaning the Security Council Resolution 47 is accepted by the two parties. The principle of self-determination has been accepted by India. What it objected to was the modalities, and the differences in the modalities does not revoke the acceptance of the principle of self-determination. So in international law, some means or form has to be found to enable the people of Jammu and Kashmir to exercise their right to self-determination, which has been accepted by India, Pakistan, and the United Nations as such. So that's the legal position. As far as reality on the ground is concerned, India is obviously in occupation. Its forces now number 900,000 in the occupied territory, and it is obvious that it has no intention to leave the territory as such, unless it is forced to do so. And therefore, on the ground, our campaign has to pursue both the irrevocability, the continued applicability of the law, which is right of self-determination, and at the same time to build political pressure on India in order to relent from its occupation and to find some means of a solution that encompasses the freely expressed wishes of the Kashmiri people. So these are the two prongs on which we have to continue to work for a solution in Kashmir.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more with you. And so in terms of building pressure, now what we have seen in the last year, in fact more than a year, is increasing concern in the Western countries also, especially the media, the rights organizations, and other civil society members. Some voices have been raised from certain legislatures also in different countries. Now, it seems that the soft power that India was enjoying has begun to erode. We also have had this EU Disinfo Lab report that has also been a severe indictment of India's disinformation campaign against Pakistan. So given that, and since you at the United Nations representing Pakistan, what is your sense of how long will it take before this acquires some kind of critical mass where the governments themselves will be hard-pressed to ignore Indian excesses?
Thank you, Jaz. A good question. I think this is obviously not a short struggle. This is a campaign in which we have to reverse at least 10 or 15 years where we were basically silenced on the issue of Jammu and Kashmir and did not raise it in the way that it should have been raised. So it's India has built up an image, it has damaged Pakistan's image, and we have to build back that image, to build and to erode India's false image, which it is doing now and which we have been doing for the past year, and India's own mistakes are contributing to the erosion of its so-called soft image, as you termed it, into what is the reality of a fascist regime in occupation of Jammu and Kashmir, oppressing the Kashmiri people, imposing fake encounters to murder people, collective punishments, etc. But this is going to be a long, long struggle. At the same time, apart from the international pressure, the conjunction has to be also the internal situation in occupied Jammu and Kashmir. It also depends a lot on the resistance of the people of Jammu and Kashmir, their continued resilience in the face of occupation, their continued ability to express their opposition, and that is the second part of the campaign that we have to pursue. And the third element of the campaign is the geostrategic position. And there, too, we have to see how to configure our relationships with the great powers, with China, with the United States, with other regional countries, in order to maximize pressure on India. So this is not going to be a short campaign. It's a strategic campaign, but Kashmir is a strategic component of our foreign policy, and we have to pursue this campaign in a strategic way. There will not be instant solutions, but we have to persist in our efforts.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That was Ambassador Munir Akram speaking with us. Let me go to Ali Sultan. Ali, as an international law expert, now, Indians also try to present an argument that they have a better legal case compared to Pakistan. Now, since memories are short, people don't really remember. It's been more than 7 decades. So tell our viewers something about the legal case on both sides.
India's principal justification rests on, according to them, a legal instrument of accession that was exchanged between the Maharaja of Kashmir and India. Whereas the correct legal position is that the Maharaja, A, did not have the competence to execute that instrument of accession because large parts of the state had indigenously revolted against his oppressive, brutal rule. So one, he didn't have the capacity under international law to enter into such an arrangement with India. Secondly, there was an element of coercion or duress that was involved because the moment when instrument of accession was actually exchanged was after the Indian troops had landed in Srinagar on the morning of 27th. And many historians, including Alistair Lamb, Stanley Walpert, have conclusively demonstrated that the instrument of accession could not have been signed before the entry of troops, of Indian troops in Srinagar. And thirdly, India never had a standstill agreement with Maharaja Hari Singh. On the other hand, Pakistan had a standstill agreement with Maharaja Hari Singh, which didn't allow the Maharaja to enter into this accession arrangement with India. And the legal advisors of the State Department of the US, as well as the Foreign and Commonwealth Office of the United Kingdom, raised this concern contemporaneously at the time, that given the existing standstill agreement between Pakistan and Hari Singh, it wasn't legal on his part to execute this instrument of accession with India. In any case, the instrument of accession, the so-called instrument of accession that was exchanged, was provisional, because when Lord Mountbatten, who at the time was the Governor General of India, and the sole competent authority to accept this instrument of accession on behalf of the Indian government or the Indian state, he penned this remark that this is accepted, this is provisionally accepted until the wishes of the people of Jammu and Kashmir have been freely exercised. That is to say that their right of self-determination has been exercised. So that's the first prong of the legal case involving India and Pakistan and Kashmir. So we have a much better legal claim as far as international law is concerned. And then this is the position which is also subsequently endorsed by the United Nations Security Council resolutions. They have never called Pakistan as an aggressor, and the solution that they have proposed through the resolutions is that of a free and fair and impartial plebiscite under the aegis of the United Nations. So that lends further credibility to our stance rather than India's stance, which is why India has always, as you also mentioned in your introduction, and you quoted Joseph Corbell, and you can quote many others who have the same viewpoint, which is that India has always been intransigent and arrogant when it comes towards the fulfillment of these United Nations Security Council resolutions. And let me also emphasize that these resolutions impose binding obligations on India. Now, India from time to time has raised this canard that these resolutions, because they were passed under Chapter 6 of the UN Charter, do not constitute binding obligations. That is not correct, because Article 25 of the United Nations Charter specifically says, very clearly says, that all decisions of the Security Council, irrespective of whether they're passed under Chapter 6 or Chapter 7, are binding on all members of the United Nations. In addition to that, in addition to Article 25 and the Namibia advisory case, which further substantiates what I just said, and then it's also substantiated further by a very well-respected former president of the International Court of Justice, Rosalind Higgins. And in addition to that, you have to interpret and understand these resolutions holistically in their proper historical framework. And as you probably will recall, and you know, that Nehru multiple times in in his interviews, in his speeches, in his addresses, in his telegrams exchanged with his Pakistani counterpart, in his meetings with the Prime Minister Muhammad Ali Bogra in the early 1950s, he pledged that Kashmiris have a right of self-determination, and that this is basically an international commitment which India owes to the rest of the world. So when you assess these Security Council resolutions in light of the pledges that were made by Nehru, that further lends legality and makes these obligations and lends them a legally binding character, as opposed to just being recommendatory, which is what India falsely has been arguing. So those are, broadly speaking, some of the parameters as far as the law is concerned. And one more thing I'd like to add, because you mentioned in your introduction about withdrawal or demilitarization in Kashmir, so that conditions could be created for the holding of a free and fair and impartial plebiscite. There also, not just the UCIP Commission proposals were rejected numerously by India. It also rejected proposals by McNaughton, as well as Owen Dixon, as you mentioned. And then there was also Dr. Graham's mediation efforts. And all of these commissions and mediatory efforts were advocating a position of parity between India and Pakistan, which is what was closer to Pakistani position as opposed to the Indian position, because India didn't even want to accept Pakistan, wrongly, of course, as an equal party to the dispute, which is why it was asking for unilateral withdrawal of Pakistani troops before it would reduce its troops, not completely withdraw them. So that's an absurd line of reasoning as far as the law is concerned, and this is reflected in the wordings and the workings of these various commissions. And lastly, Pakistan numerously offered India to take this matter to the ICJ or for an arbitration, so that an independent court or an arbitration panel could conclusively pronounce on this matter of demilitarization, which ended up being the main point of contention in the end. But India, of course, always rebuffed our offers. So obviously, we have no skeleton in our cupboard, which is why we're completely comfortable taking this matter to international courts or arbitration. It's always India which has refused or rebuffed our proposals. So those are, broadly speaking, some of the international law aspects of the Kashmir dispute.
Thank you, Ali. That was an excellent overview. Now, the thing is that you talked about Pandit Nehru's commitments and all of that, and they're on record. But Pandit Nehru also, there are historians who have talked about it, wasn't ever particularly committed to this, and ultimately was trying to find some kind of rules and invoke that legal principle of rebus sic stantibus, with reference to Pakistan's entry into Seato and Cento agreement. So just give us a little bit, the legal perspective on that also.
Look, it doesn't really matter whether he meant it or not. What mattered was that did he come across vis-a-vis the rest of the world as if he meant it or not? And he made these pledges very extravagantly, very eloquently, multiple times. So as far as the rest of the world is concerned, these are binding commitments on his part. And yes, you're right. Nehru famously himself wrote in one of his books that when it came to Kashmir, he was often led astray, and he acted very sentimentally when it came to Kashmir, because he himself belonged to a Kashmiri Pandit family. But coming back to the other point that you raised, which is the doctrine of rebus, and how that's not inapplicable to Kashmir, is because for India to insist very hypocritically that Pakistan was the only was the only party which was seeking a Cold War alliance is absolutely wrong and contrary to facts, because India actually was also very much aligned with the Soviet Union. It used Soviet Union to stonewall the Kashmir issue for decades. It used its veto, the threat of its veto, to stonewall these efforts. So rebus, to begin with, the threshold for meeting this doctrine under international law is incredibly high and almost impossibly to meet. So when you apply those thresholds to the case at hand, clearly this doctrine is inapplicable in Kashmir, and India has just self-servingly advanced this line of reasoning. The other thing that one can infer from this is that the fact that they argue rebus presupposes that they accept that the resolutions on Kashmir are actually binding commitments. Otherwise, why would they even justify not fulfilling them via the doctrine of rebus? So
Right.
in a way, this.
Now, that's an excellent explanation. One final question, Ali. That was then, and of course, as Ambassador Akram also said, that that's the principle and it's irrevocable. But now we also have new contours of the problem. Now, legally speaking, do we have space to also look at the current contours and prepare a case against India on the basis of that?
Well, Ijaz, as you know, going to the National Court of Justice requires certain jurisdictional thresholds that have to be met. And those are very difficult to meet in the case of Kashmir. But there might be some creative ways of taking the issue, especially the human rights violations, the crimes against humanity which India has been committing since August 5th, and even much more before that as well. So the government is looking into all options at this point, and I'm sure that the decision that is ultimately taken will serve our national interests to the fullest extent possible.
Okay, great. Thank you. That was Ali Sultan. Ali, I must also thank you for clarifying for us the legal positions of India and Pakistan in this dispute. I'm now joined by Ambassador Arif Kamal, a former Pakistani diplomat and a Kashmiri who has been active in highlighting the history of the dispute as also its current contours. Thank you, Ambassador Kamal, for being on the program. We're talking about, of course, the 5th Jan 1949 UNCIP proposal that was ultimately not accepted by India. Then, of course, we went through a bit of history. So give us a sense of the current contours now and whether the options in terms of legal as well as diplomatic options, and how many of those options are we currently exercising?
Well, I think at the very outset, it's important to know that the resolutions starting from what it was in August 1948 and its further extension, as we know, of 5th January 1949, have one similarity and one key message, and that is the people of Jammu and Kashmir state are the principal party to the dispute. And therefore, it's more of explicit recognition of the right of self-determination, which is already enshrined in the UN resolutions. But my take on this question is slightly different than what many legalistic point of views that come about. I believe that the resolutions only reaffirm what is inherent and what exists in its own right. So when we say that the United Nations, UNCIP or another organ recognize the Kashmiri people's right to self-determination. It is only an acknowledgement of the right and a resolve to implement it. Now, of course, I need to slightly deviate from this and to mention one incident in when I was in Ottawa. The people at the External Affairs that were dealing with India, Pakistan would come to me and say, well, the resolutions have lost potency, quote unquote, because of the time factor and because of the stimuli. I'll go back and say, well, if the time lag of 24 years or less had passed from the time the resolutions were adopted till the time that the Simla was signed, even if Simla meant anything in that, more time has passed, more water has flown down the river Jhelum from 70s to the time that we live in today. So this is totally a misplaced argument because if the right is inherent, it cannot be unilaterally taken away. And if there are commitments at the multilateral forum, that too cannot be what you call taken away by even by a bilateral agreement by consent of India and Pakistan, which is not there. So I think in the current context, we should learn the lessons of the last 70 years and see how we can operationalize the principal party's role in terms of its face, in terms of its voice, and let's not confuse the Wakalatnama with what the Kashmiri people could themselves be encouraged to say and do. And I think that would bring about a qualitative change. Of course, there's no instant solution that we can address, but that would go a long way to undo what you call the passivity that existed in the past, say, 5 decades or more. This is my take on that at the outset. Yeah.
Right. I think this is brilliant because I think the central point that you've made, and I think that point is the real heart of the issue, and that is the right to self-determination, and that's something which inheres in all the resolutions. And actually, the differences were about demilitarization and the rest of it. But thank you so much. That was Ambassador Arif Kamal speaking with us. We shall take a short break and return to discuss the brutal terrorist attack against the Hazara community by Daesh. Stay with us. Welcome back to In Focus and to our second story tonight. 11 Hazara coal mine workers were kidnapped and murdered by Daesh terrorists in Mach, Balochistan. Another 4 were critically injured. Provincial government officials have described the act as sectarian terrorism. This was confirmed when Daesh, the terrorist group which now has presence in Afghanistan, claimed responsibility. This is not the first such attack. The Hazara have regularly been targeted by Daesh, and before the arrival on the scene of Daesh by the terrorist group Lashkar-e-Jhangvi. To discuss this terrorist attack, I'm joined by Anwar Ul Haq Kakar and Lieutenant General Talat Masood, the former chairman of Pakistan Ordnance Factories. Thank you to both panelists. General Masood, give me your first thoughts on this extremely sad incident.
Well, I think it is shocking, although it is not surprising, because this is what they have been doing in the past, and they continue to sort of operate, although not with that much of freedom as they had in the past. But yet, as you can see, that they are very effective, and they really go for the Hazaras because they think they are Shias, and they think that the Shias have to be murdered. This is a sort of a mission of theirs, and at the same time, it has of course political connotations, because it is not just because of they are Shias. It is also because the Arab conflict also spills over as far as these things are concerned. So I think all these factors are such which are very shameful, and it is the responsibility of the state to really protect them and also make sure that we do not become a part of this Iranian and the Arab conflict, and we should keep away. But the border and Balochistan is such, then there are several other factors also that are promoting lawlessness in Balochistan.
Right. Meanwhile, I've also been joined by Dr. Mir Saadat, who's founding president, Balochistan Council for Peace and Policy. Dr. Baloch, give us a sense of what do you think is happening here. As I said in my opening, it's not the first time the Hazara community has been targeted. And Talat Masood was talking about the fact that the Hazara think that they've been abandoned by the state. What are your thoughts on this?
If we look to the broader picture, what I believe in is that foremost we have to see that what is the role of our politicians in this whole situation. It is not the first time that the Hazara community has been going through such a turmoil. And last time when it happened, sadly at that time, our politicians were more busy in selecting their own new chief minister than doing anything for the Hazaras. Even now, if you go and you look at the Twitter trend over there, our politicians, they are all busy blaming each other. And we don't realize that what's really happening over here. Because if the politicians, they don't play their role properly, of course, the community, they feel like they're not being listened upon. And
okay,
if the
I get your
listen,
right. I get the thrust of your argument. Let's go to Senator Kakar. We've managed to connect with him. Senator Kakar, there's a general feeling that Hazara have been abandoned by the state. This is something that Talat Masood talked about. This is something that Mir Saadat Baloch was just talking about. Since your party rules the province, give me your thoughts on what has happened and how is the government going to handle this?
Thank you for having me. This is a sweeping statement that the state has abandoned the Hazara as a community. And I do not agree to this skewed view, to be honest with you. Why I'm saying so? I'll come to the current government and my party's position on that. But let's unfold the story from the side of the state for the last 2 decades. Hazara community, unfortunately, has been target of these thugs, these terrorists, these beasts, whatever you want to call them, who is usually masqueraded with human face and flesh, but in reality they are the beasts. And this beast sometimes appear with the name of Daesh, sometimes with Lashkar-e-Jangvi, sometimes with TTP, so on and so forth. The group, because of their salient features, have always been distinguished and a soft target. But in the pursuance of these terrorists in the last 2 decades, I can name 200 individuals who have laid their lives to avenge the death of this Pakistani marginalized community. They are not exclusive at all. They are one of us. We believe in the same constitution. We believe in the same framework of the state. They have been contributing in the armed forces of Pakistan. They have been contributing in the business community, in different social sectors and the starters of the society. If a marginalized group tries to enunciate or articulate this feeling of their victimization as something which has been abandoned by the state, they are not seeing either the full picture or they choose not to see that. Who killed Nasser Mahmood Raid? Who killed Saeed Badini? Who killed Suleiman Badini? Who killed... there is a wholesome list. And the revenge for the targeting of this community was all done by non-Hazaras. They were not non-Hazaras primarily. They were all the agents of the state of Pakistan. So this impression I completely disagree with. Now coming to current government's position. You must have be remembering the days when, unfortunately, 150, 100, 120 death toll on a single day, either of Hazaras or even non-Hazaras when it came to the cadets of police academy. I was the first when I got introduced with you on a TV interview show. I still recall that day. That spectacular so-called attacks from the side of the enemy has come to a sharp decline. It has not completely been eliminated. I mean, the threat has not been completely eliminated, but it has come to the sharp decline, and that decline was primarily because of the tangible and kinetic responses from the state. It was not due to some narrative building, it was not due to some de-radicalization program, but rather hardcore efforts by the state institutions in terms of flesh and blood, which we have paid to bring down their killing capacity, and we have successfully done that. Now what happened 2 days back or 3 days back, unfortunately, a year or two of lull, relatively lull, they have taken advantage of that lull. They have regrouped themselves on Afghan soil, and there is visibility of these groups and individuals on intelligence picture. And we are not obfuscated by their activities. We have a pretty much fair idea who they are and where their presence is, where their local connections are. All what is required is, at the moment, which I can divulge, that state would come up with a strong response, organized response, and a consistent response. We're going to fight them till end, no matter what.
Right. Thank you so much. That was Senator Anwar Ul Haq Kakar. Thank you also to Lieutenant Talat Masood and Dr. Mir Saadat Baloch. This is all from In Focus tonight. We shall see you tomorrow at the same time. Keep following our latest updates on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.